Okay, Cisco. What is it like to be autistic?
Well, it's hard to explain without using analogies, but the best analogy I've found is that it's like being a foreigner. Constant foreigner, no matter where you go. You can sort of see how people act to an extent, but their norms, their cultures, are always sort of alien to you. You can learn to an extent, and for most verbal autists they eventually do. But it's always not really natural. But it's interesting in its own way to see how the non-autists, for lack of a better term, act. To kind of observe them and sort of see how they form their societies. It's both interesting and alienating in its own way.
And how do autistic people think?
Well, that I cannot answer for all autistic people. That is to say, everybody has their own sort of mentality. They think their own ways, but for me, at least, it's always been in concepts rather than discrete pictures or words or languages. Feelings and concepts. But for us, as how we think, there's also a lot of... For some people there's rationality, for some people there's emotions. For me there's kind of a mixture of the two. I have my emotions, but at the same time, unless I'm having a meltdown or unless the emotions are way too intense, I'm able to more or less separate myself from them. Now, again, I don't know if that's the same for all autists or not. But under most normal circumstances, I'm able to feel the emotions but not be controlled by them.
And what sensory issues do you have?
Well, for me, it's primarily sound and smell. Sound and smell. Light sometimes gets in there. For the most part, touch isn't too much of an issue, although there are issues with palate.
And so when you are impacted by these sensory issues, be it sound or smell or light, how does that feel, or how is it that it impacts you?
Well, it depends. There's also temperature changes as well, or, in general, not really sense of touch so much as other tactile senses. For that, I oftentimes, it's like having hives for those senses related to touch. For the palate and for smells, it's nausea. For example, if I'm in too close proximity of cigarette smoke, I get nauseated, I get nauseated to the point where I have difficulty breathing. It makes me want to throw up. And in the case of palate sensory issues, I often do. So I usually avoid things that trigger my palate. For sound, it's headaches and difficulty concentrating.
Okay. And what is special about Horseboy?
Well, there's quite a lot of things that are special about Horseboy. But I would say the primary things is that they don't try to inherently change who the autist is. Like a lot of, therapy sessions and other types of methods such as drugs and what have you. They're simply trying to teach the autist how to cope. In a way, sort of helping them integrate rather than forcing them to conform. And in that regard, they use the horse as a tool for that. A tool for teaching, a tool for calmness. It's just a lot less of a therapy environment and more of a pro-socialization educational environment, which I find much more refreshing than the therapy rooms.
And can stims be positive?
Oh, yes. And before I start on how stims can be positive, I'd like to say that everybody stims. Everybody. You stim. You, the person watching this video right now. You stim. You just don't know it. This thing, this thing, this thing, those are stems. It's just that those are stems that are conforming to the neurotypical idea of what a stem is. The autistic stems, the hand waving, the flapping, the echolalia, those aren't quite as common, and so they're not thought of as being acceptable. I mean, no, granted, some people, even neurotypical, sometimes stim excessively, like, if they tap too much or if they foot tap too hard, things like that. But everybody stims. It's not just an autistic thing. And in fact, I'll go into that later, but...
Just going to pause you so that we don't get that sound.
I'll wait.
Yeah. We can cut this out of the footage, so that's easy.
Yes.
Sorry, so you were saying back to stims?
Yes. Stims can be positive in that they can be used to reinforce a skill set. For example, if somebody likes to tap their foot a lot, that means they're getting a stem out of their feet, so you could get them to run. If they like to wave a lot, you could get them to maybe learn conducting, or maybe if they wave a certain way, get them to do martial arts. Basically, the idea is, if they're stimming in a certain way, that action is soothing to them, and if you can get them into a skill set that they are interested in and uses that stim, you can get them into social environments, therefore, that are more conducive and more accepting of them, and overall you can get them more integrated into society, which is, or at least should be, the goal of any reasonable person dealing with autism, is to get them integrated into society.
And can you apply that to yourself? Did you have a certain stimming manner that allowed you to integrate into a certain situation in society?
Well, yes. I do chainmail, and that was a hand stim. I remember as a kid, now they had done things to sort of treat the autistic symptoms without knowing it was autism. And one of those things was they would give me a stress ball. And looking back into that, I was stimming, because the situations in school were being very stressful for me. But then I found out that when I was working on this chainmail, which was something that independently interested me, that it was calming me as well. And so I put two and two together. I realized that I had naturally stumbled into a skill set and a community where my stimming was encouraged, just as long as it was applied in a certain way.
And what are the gifts of autism?
Well, as if a unique perspective isn't gift enough. Well, more concrete gifts. The obsession can be channeled into focus. For example, if a child is obsessed with a certain field of study or concept, you can get them to learn a lot about that without having to force an education into their heads, which is, again, going back to what Horseboy does. They follow the child's gifts. They move him from where he is to where they want him to be, using gentle segues. And that is one of the gifts of autism, is that the child has a genuine interest in things. And not just children, adults too. But, I realize that as autism is becoming more and more prevalent, that most of the autism focus is going to be on children. So I want to emphasize that getting children to learn about what they're interested in, and getting them to learn about the ancillary things to what they're interested in, rather than trying to get them to learn something just because they have to learn it, is a very good gift, and it should be applied to all children and all people. But another gift of autism is oftentimes they have a natural talent in certain areas that's offset by their disabilities in certain areas. Again, I'm not going to say that autism has no disabilities. We do have disabilities. But we also have gifts. And it's a net trade-off. So in this case, a lot of times the sensory issues are because of hypersensitivity. That they can hear things or perceive things or see things or smell things that most people can't. And this can be very useful in certain careers, certain fields of study. This heightened perception is very useful. I think another gift of autism is that we're oftentimes more altruistic, which is often one of the disabilities as well, when we assume that other people aren't as giving and as generous and as nice as we are. That we get taken advantage of, and a lot of the adults on the spectrum end up being highly paranoid. I definitely am one of those examples. I am very paranoid of many people and situations because I was taken advantage of a lot of the time. But that gift of being I'm not going to say pure-hearted, but a very, very well-meaning person. And that there's a sort of simplicity in how we interact with the world. We can learn the complicated stuff, and we often end up using it because that's the only method that people seem to understand. But if you interact with an autistic person outside of their training to interact with the normal world, it's oftentimes a lot more direct. And I think the world could use more of that.
And you spoke about how in autism, if you are autistic, you have a special interest or a special focus. And what is your special interest and focus?
Well, I have a few. One of those, which is CHML. The other is cybernetics and computers in general. But cybernetics in particular, which is sort of the idea of how communication and control mechanisms work. This idea that we can study, in essence, sociology from an academic and scientific perspective. This idea that we can then use those methods not just of sociological communication, but also of basic, nervous system communication, endocrine communication, and do similar analogies to machinery is what made a lot of strides in the field of bionics, where you combine organic systems with mechanical systems, advanced prosthetics and what have you. That's been an interest of mine for some time. Also, autism in general has also been sort of an obsessive of mine to kind of figure out, what am I? Why am I what I am? What makes me what I am? And what makes me different from people? What are the good things? What are the bad things about that? And that sort of led me into advocacy in a sense.
And have you found answers to those questions?
Mostly through introspection, not through much in the way of research.
And did Horseboy get you to some of those answers?
Yes, they did. And I've done my best to give them some of those answers as well. And I want to give the world those answers eventually.
And what is your message to parents?
My message to parents would be to look at autism as a sort of cultural divide rather than a sickness. Yes, your child will have difficulties in some things, but think of it more as your child is an alien, a foreigner in this country of normal social function, rather than a disabled child. Now, granted, disabled children often need help as well, but their help is a little more different than what autistic children need. It's not so much that we can't do things so much as we do things differently. There's nothing really new in autism, in the sense that there's nothing that is autistic that is not present in the human population to some extent. I like to think of it as not just the cultural analogy, but also as sort of dials on a television. Autism doesn't remove any dials or add any dials. It just changes the settings. Some of them are lower, some of them are higher. But they're still all the same.
And I've just been watching an interview that Rupert Isaacson did with Temple Grandin. And Temple Grandin talks about autism and how some autists become, the world's best scientists or a wonderful musician. In fact, she herself is an expert in animal behavior. So this might be a bit of a stretch here, but you were talking about how autism is becoming more and more prevalent. So do you think maybe it's an evolutionary stage for mankind?
I think it very well could be. I think in a lot of ways it's much like sickle cell anemia is in terms of the evolutionary response, in that you've got the heterogeneous sickle cell anemia, which gives a protection against malaria. But if you've got homogeneous sickle cell anemia, that's going to present a difficulty. However, the reason those genes still exist is because of the heterogenic superiority. So the fact that you've got people on the Asperger level or on the autism level that you're verbal, but you have these gifts and being able to become good at science and good at maths and good at all sorts of different things, these highly specialized people. I think it's a social evolution of not of individual humans, but the human species. And that I think a lot of times autism has been responsible for a lot of our scientific progress and a lot of our technological progress. I think, autism may not have been responsible for a lot of our governmental and social structure progress. I think that's where we still need neurotypicality. They're the social people. Not that we're not social, it's just that, UNTs are better at it. And we're better at advancing us technologically. So we need both types of minds. And I think Temple said it herself that the world needs every kind of mind. And I agree with her there.
Fantastic. And just to close, is there anything that you would like to add about autism, your experiences with Horseboy, or anything really with that?
I would say that in my time, the most progress I've made is when people were on my side and trying to help me be who I am as successfully as possible, rather than trying to make me into something more like them. That's where I've seen the most success, both in myself and in everybody.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.